On this channel, I specialise in making really complex looking images easy to create. So just follow along with my step-by-step tutorial of this painting and you will amaze yourself. Okay, so as always, I'm using the app Procreate on an iPad with the Apple Pencil. But whatever app or tablet you happen to be using, I'm sure you can use some of my process and techniques to follow along as well. But as such, within the app Procreate, I'm using an A4 default size canvas, which is 297 by 210 millimeters, and that's at 300 dpi. In terms of the color profile, mine is set to the sRGB 2.1, which is on the list here, again within Procreate. In terms of the colors, I have pre-selected a range of colors here and created a palette. Each of these colors has what we call a hexadecimal code linked to it, and each of the codes is down in the video description. You can take a note of them, type them into this box one at a time and press enter. The color appears up here and then you can just tap it together yourself. Or next to the codes is a link that takes you to my Patreon page and you can download the color file for free to save you some time. And obviously that's where you can go to support this channel and access exclusive content too. In terms of the brushes, within airbrushing, again, all default brushes that come free within the app Procreate. I'm going to use within airbrushing the soft brush, probably the medium brush. Within inking, I might use the studio pen. I might use within organic the rainforest brush, just a little bit. And within the artistic range of brushes, I'm going to use the leatherwood brush probably too. If you like this kind of video tutorial, please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, hit the subscribe, and don't forget that bell notification to make sure you're notified of all my future videos too. And with all that said and done, we're going to get started. So I don't like to start with a white canvas, so I'm going to go to the first colour on the top row, and from this little circle I'm going to drag into the canvas area, let go, and it will flood fill. We may as well stay on the same layer, so we're still on layer 1. I'm going to use the airbrushing soft brush. I'm going to move along to the third colour on the top row. I'm going to put my brush size to about 15% and 100% opacity, and about 3/4 of the way up, I'm just going to do a band straight across initially. Then I'm going to go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur. I'm going to swipe this across to about the 50%. I'm going to choose to create a new layer, press on the plus symbol, so layer 2, stay with the same color, stay with the same brush, the soft brush, but I'm going to put the percentage of the size, about 80%, which is really huge, and 100% opacity, and just where the sun is going to be, I'm going to tap that in, and maybe just tap it across a few times too, like so. And it does tend to get a little bit of this kind of banding when you use a brush of that size, which clearly we don't want at the end, so I'm just going to tap it a few more times just to further spread that across. I want to preserve a little bit of that purple in the top corners, but not too much. And to soften it in, I'm going to go back to the adjustments, Gaussian blur. I'm going to blur it, well, to about 20%, should get rid of all the banding and just nicely soften it in as well. And you can zoom in, you can see it's completely gone. We've got that nice kind of transition. We've really got a little bit more of this lighter colour and a little bit more of the purple preserved over on this side. We're going to create a new layer, so back to our layers, press the plus symbol, layer 3. Back to our colours, I'm going to choose the second colour on the top row, still with the airbrush, soft brush rather, within airbrushing. Turn it down this time to about 10% size, 100% opacity, and just a little bit above halfway, I'll do a band of this across, doesn't need to be particularly straight, something like that. Adjustments, Gaussian blur, blur that in quite significantly, somewhere about the 50%. I'm going to create a new layer, layer 3, and still with the soft brush within airbrushing, I'm going to choose the second colour along on the top row. I'm going to put it down to about 8% size and 100% opacity, and just a little bit above halfway, I'm going to do a line of this across. Doesn't need to be a neat line. Go back to the colours. Colours are a bit jumbled up, doesn't matter. I'm going to go from the third from the right, and just slightly overlapping that colour, I'll do a band of this. Again, doesn't need to be straight lines at all. And then the colour straight in the middle there, so fourth from either end, we'll do Again, overlapping just a little bit of that colour as well. Not very much different, but there you go. To the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and I'm going to blur them in significantly to about the 50%. It has a subtle impact, but it is there. I'm going to go to my layers and create a new layer, layer 4. I'm going to change the little N on this layer, which is for the blend mode, which currently is set to normal by default. I'm going to scroll down to the add. I'm going to stay on our airbrushing soft brush. I'm going to change the colour, however, to this really vibrant yellow colour, which on the face of it looks like it would be just the wrong kind of colour to use on almost anything really. But because we've got the blend mode on, we're going to turn the size of the brush up, really quite big, probably to about 60%, and really low on the opacity at about 5%. It's going to introduce this really quite subtly. So we're going to imagine where the sun is going to be. I'm going to tap it a few times there. So that was 3 plus, try another 3, keep going, another 3. That's starting to get the right kind of effect. I think we could even go bigger than 60% just to push it into the bigger scene as well. So let's go up to, well, let's try 100%, let's see what that's like. It's really big, just a couple on that setting, and we're going to have to reduce it back down now to a much smaller size. Let's try about 20%. I think where the sun is going to be, tap it a few times in that spot, reduce it down even further, 10% size, right in the middle, a few more times on top. Then we can go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and blur that in to soften it, and about 20% does the trick. We're getting this really nice warm glowing gradient now, which is really effective. Okay, I'm going to create a new layer, layer 5. Again, I'm going to tap on the little N, change it by scrolling down to the add. I'm going to push it a little bit further. Sometimes I just prefer to keep it on separate layers. So we're still on the soft brush with an airbrushing. Let's go back up the scale a little bit. So 15% size on the yellow, 5% opacity, aim for the middle, tap it a few more times still, turn it down to the 10%, a couple more taps, 8%, a few more taps, and we can just go like that, 5%, a few more taps, then we can go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, blur it in to about the 15%, and if you untick it you can see that it has had quite a bold impact, which is great. On the same layer, I'm perhaps going to just change to the white, stay with this soft brush with an airbrushing, turn it down to 4% size, turn it more significantly up to 20% opacity, aim for the very middle, tap it quite a number of times just to really get the bright white of the sun where it belongs, which is nice. I'm just going to duplicate that layer, really creates a bright version of it, and then I'm just on one of those, maybe the version underneath, I'll go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, blur that layer in just so we get a softening in, maybe about 40%. And you can untick any of these layers and you can really see the impact that each of these layers adds when it's combined together. Looking at the sun, I feel like it needs to be a little bit brighter, a little bit bigger, so back to the white, still with the same brush. Perhaps I'll put it up a little bit more, 6% size, well, 30% opacity. It doesn't matter where you put it really because it's the number of times you press it too, but I'm going to go for 30% opacity, tap it a few times, get the sun exactly the size you want, and I think that's working better. Just looked a bit too small, there was too much of the yellow glow surrounding it. I think that works a bit better. Back to my yellow, still on the same brush. I'm going to put it up to about 15% size and back down really low at about 3% opacity. I just want a bit more of that yellow glow in the top area, so I'm just kind of like in a semicircle round motion, just adding a little bit more of it in that upper region. I think that's starting to work optimally now. I think that's better. Okay, so we're going to create a new layer, layer 7, but I'm going to move it down underneath all the sun glow layers. That way, when we add these features, they're going to sit comfortably inside that overall glow, so bits of it will get bleached out and just work the way that really is going to work best. I'm going to go to this purple color, second on the top row. I'm going to change to the organic rainforest brush. I'm going to reset it. I have been using it as a different setting on a different tutorial, so I've reset it so it's the default settings on this now. 5% size, 100% opacity, and I'm just going to, in the distance, start adding some features, maybe some treetops that really for the most part you're not going to see, but I'm adding them quite strongly initially and then I'm going to reduce them. So it doesn't matter if it goes further down because like I say, I'm going to reduce them anyway. Go to the layer, tap on the N, and dial it back really significantly to about 20%. I'm also going to go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, blur it in to about the 10%. And I'm also going to go in with the eraser set to the soft brush with an airbrushing. I'm going to put that up really quite big at about 30% size, 30% opacity. And I can just start to now tap to remove the impact when it's too close to the sun. I want this to be something that kind of forms and builds in the peripheral, not anywhere near the direct sun. So again, I can just keep removing that a little bit until we're happy. So we get a hint of it over here and maybe just a hint of it there, perhaps a bit less there. It's mainly on this side that I want that feature. And it doesn't matter lower down, we're not going to have that because we're going to have water anyway. But I'm just reduce it a little bit so you start to see the effect building in nicely. So I'm going to create a new layer, layer 8. Importantly, it's still underneath all these sun glow layers. We have the blend mode set to default normal. We're going to go in again with the soft brush with an airbrushing. We're going to use a second colour on the bottom row, and with a size of about 5% and 30% opacity, I want to just aim a good section, a good chunk underneath that sun. So somewhere about here, do a line across. If you're not very good at a straight line, you can just hold it and it snaps to a straight line for you, which is great. And then again with the eraser, I want to subdue elements of it. So we're still on the soft brush, just like we used it before. We're on 30% size and 30% opacity. So I'm quite happy with those settings. I'm just going to soften it in over on this side. I really just want it to be more apparent over here, and then just get rid of some of it like that. I'm going to create a new layer. Pretty much everything I'm doing is going to be underneath this sun layers now. So this is something that's going to be moving forward. We'll just leave them as they are. We could even, to be fair, pinch those together. So it all now just becomes on one layer that we can just toggle on and off. And we'll just leave that layer as it is at the very top. But on this new layer, layer 9, I'm going to go back a colour. First layer on the bottom row, I'm going to go to the artistic leatherwood brush. I'm going to have it set to the top end of 2% size, but low on the opacity at around 25%. Let's trial that. And we just want to start building in some land in this region. If you press on more, then you get a bigger shape with this brush, which is nice. Release the pressure and it reduces. We are going to Gaussian blur this in, so we're just getting an initial texture and placement for some of these features. And I want it to be just kind of like a dash, or rather a long line across, and then it rises to meet some of those bands and colours in this section. It doesn't have to be a neat shape at all. Go over it a few times. Maybe we could just introduce it over here as well. Again, we're going to blur this in somewhat anyway, so have a few breakaway little sections that for the largest part probably will disappear, but that's fine. And then another section here perhaps. We're just laying the groundwork, and then maybe as we come closer we'll just have some more shapes here, and then more shapes. Perhaps I'll increase it, 5% size, increase it, 40% opacity, nudged up to 41%. Often when I give these percentages, it's approximate, but I'll put it to the 40%, that's what I said. But if it's 41, honestly, it won't make much difference, will it? But we'll try and be precise as we can, because bear in mind, really, it's also to do with pencil pressure. So, you know, we could both have it set to 40%, but I could be pressing harder, you could be pressing lighter, so it just varies. We're doing something where we're building it up gradually anyway, so I wouldn't overly obsessed with that exact percentage. It's somewhere in that region, and that should work for us both. But we're just blotting in this area, perhaps a little bit more. Perhaps just have a section that comes over here too. We're going to go over this with other colours, but it's just getting something of a placement like that. Now that we've got something to work with, I'm going to go back to the layer that had all the sun glow and slide and duplicate it, which obviously has done too much here. We don't like that, and that's fine. On the top version or the bottom version, doesn't matter. I'm going to go to the transform, down here, flip vertically, and the placement should be absolutely perfect for what we need. So just untap that. It is too strong, however. I want to subdue it, so back to the layer, and on the A, we just tap on it and then dial it back on this little slider, which is fantastic. I'm going to put it back to Well, somewhere around the 40% I think is working quite nicely. Now, maybe the 50%, a little bit stronger, I think is good. And we can go to the adjustments, motion blur, could be the Gaussian blur, but sometimes I like to use the motion blur instead. And we'll just sideways swipe until we're just softening that in slightly. So maybe about 20% will do our job for us. And then we're getting that nice glowing reflection. So now we'll go with that layer, and perhaps we ought to just move it, drag it underneath the layer with the land features. And you can see the impact that that's now had. So that instantly makes it kind of believable as maybe water. So we'll go back to the land feature, layer 9. I'm going to go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and blur that in to about the 5%. It's just a reference point just to add other things to, mainly. So from that layer, we're going to click the plus symbol and create a new layer. Somewhat confusingly, because we've merged some of the layers, it's now calling it layer 9, but we're not going to worry too much about that. It's the layer above this feature anyway. I'm going to switch to the inking Studio Pen. Default settings, I'm going to turn it down to 5% size and not 100%, so maybe about 70% opacity. And then we're going to just add some grass, some reeds, some things that are sticking up. Again, we're going to blur this in, so you don't need to worry. It does look too sharp initially, but we're definitely going to soften this in, so it doesn't matter. So we want some bits that are just going to really stick up and be nice and long, and then you can have lots of this shapes and grass that can be nice and short too in other places. Try and vary it up. It's very easy to get stuck in producing the same kind of movement, so just try and vary it up. Rest your hand for a moment, go back to it, add some more, and we're going to kind of use the shapes that we've already put in place as a guide. We can have blades and things that grow from that point, and just keep adding and building this up. Allow it to collect in larger or lesser amounts. Just try and mess it up a little bit. Perhaps things that just cut across and just create a bit more chaos. It's never going to be completely neat if it's an organic matter, so introduce things that blades of grass that bend straight over and cut through some of the other shapes that you've already created. That'd be more realistic. Just random ones that stick up here and there. And then maybe as we get further over here, less of it. I'm going to go to the adjustments, motion blur, and just blur that in slightly. It doesn't need to be a lot. About 10%. Sideways seems to work quite well. I'm going to go to the layer, slide and duplicate it, transform, flip vertically, and then we could just move it down, and that's going to form a basis of reflections in the water too. So try and line it up. You might need to zoom in to do that, and that's fine. Something like this. Then with that bottom version, again, I'm going to go back to the adjustments, motion blur, and just blur that in even more. So it's not quite as distinct. You decide how you want to do it. You can go straight to left and right, but you could try diagonally going down or straight up and down, and it's going to blur in different ways. So I'm just going to reset that and try again. So still on the adjustments, motion blur. I'm going to perhaps just start from the middle and then go down diagonally, and it blurs in both directions, and I think that works. So I've done mine to about 16% there, but I can try that again. Around the 15%, yeah. I'm going to go back to the original layer 9 that had the main shapes we put in, and probably go back to the artistic leatherwood brush. It's still set at, well, it's set at a big size because we did the foreground detail, so I'm going to turn it down. Top part at 2%, about 20% opacity, and I just perhaps want to go in and just tidy up some of these shapes. I'm going to start thinking about putting a tree and some other details in here too. I also want to introduce some darker colours in the mix. I think are going to work. So again, we can put that back up to a larger size, just blot in a bit more of this. Back up to the top version of layer 9 and realise we've got lots of layer 9s. We're going to create a new layer. Here we go. We've got a number change now again, so we've got a layer 11, so that's perfect. And we're going to just use the first colour still on the middle row, but this time with the inking Studio Pen set to, it's going to have to be bigger than it was for the grass. So about 15% size should do, 70% strength, and I'm just going to introduce a tree, bring a nice sort of tree trunk. Obviously it's going to be thicker at the base, and then as it comes up it can just dwindle off, release the pressure and introduce a wobble. can always go back in there and thicken it up, add another branches in there, again, wobble them off, reduce the pressure, and then allow the shape to become a little bit more shaky as well. So think about matching the branch size with where it grows from. So anything from this point is not going to be as thick as that. So if you did a hugely thick branch here, it's not going to look appropriate for where it grows from. So anything growing from here is going to have to be thinner than the point at which it jumps from, really, in essence. So as we come up, obviously we're going to get finer and finer branches. Spend a little while just adding a series of branches to this tree. Trees are a bit of a pain when it comes to adding loads of branches, but there's, you know, apart from using perhaps a stamp brush, which is not really something I'm in favour of, there's not really a quick way of doing branches other than just getting in there and getting on with it, really. Fortunately, trees are something that I do like to draw and paint, so for me it's not so much of a bother. But if it's something you struggle with, then, you know, it's often something that you need to spend the time practicing, so spend some time. Once you get so far with it, you could always slide and duplicate that layer, go to the transform and put it on the freeform, and you can reduce it, move that set of branches, rotate it with the little green button outside the box there, as you can see, change its shape, put it somewhere else, and you get like a mini version of the whole tree growing from one of the branches, which really can save you a lot of time. If you zoom in, you get a lot of branches right there now. And you could do exactly the same thing again with that layer, so you can slide and duplicate that layer, transform, move it somewhere else. Maybe you could even flip it horizontally, so you're not going to get too much of that repetition. Find somewhere else for it, maybe even reduce the size further. And there we go. I'm going to try the same again, but now I'm going to merge all of those layers together. Difficult to do. If you're struggling to pinch it, you can't quite get it because it is awkward. Tap the top version, merge down, tap it again, merge down, and they're all on one layer now, which means you can slide and duplicate it, transform, and the top version again. You can just keep doing this and keep ramping up the number of branches. Zoom in so you can see exactly where you're putting it. It really can be a useful way of just multiplying the process, or speeding it up really. Duplicate, transform, flip horizontally, distort it if you need to. I'm going to put it down here this time. Slide, duplicate it, transform, freeform, also rotate it a bit, reduce the scale, put it up here. Again, I'm going to merge all those layers. So merge down on each of the layers in layer 11 until we get it all in one layer again, slide and duplicate it, and we can just keep going like this, because every time we do that, we create a miniature version that has way more branches on it, which is, you know, going to be really quite useful. Zoom in, we can't quite get the placement of it. Maybe just pinch it in to make it thinner, place it here, select that layer again, duplicate it. There is a chance that you'll notice that this technique has been used, but probably not. You can always go in there and just remove some of the obvious duplications anyway if it becomes too apparent. Duplicate, transform, again, just shift it around, reduce it in scale, rotate, find an appropriate place to put it, merge them down, merge down, merge down the last time, slide, duplicate the whole lot again, transform, and here we go again. A little bit repetitive, but there's not really a way around it. There's going to be some form of repetition when drawing a tree, short of cheating and using a stamp tool. I don't like to use the word cheat, but it kind of is. Some would regard this as a method of cheating anyway, so, you know, it is what it is. Whenever you've got a digital format, there's different methods and different tools and techniques and ways of achieving the same thing, and sometimes it more closely resembles what you would do with traditional materials, and other times it seems a million miles apart. This, I would say, is definitely a shortcut. It's a set of techniques that you can use, and it just takes your own work at least it's your own lines and your own shapes, and it just allows you to use them to speed up the process a little bit. Merge down, slide to duplicate, transform, and let's find somewhere else to put some more of these branches. And it doesn't take that many times, a few times, but you're really starting to get just a huge amount of tiny little branches now that really would have been a pain to have done completely manually. And it might be that you want to put it up here, but you don't want all of the branch section. So I'm just going to line it up like so. Go to the eraser, happens to be on soft brush at quite a small size. Just remove the bottom portion so then it kind of blends in. Merge down, do it a couple more times, duplicate. Okay, I'm just going to finally merge them all together, all those versions of layer 11, and now we have quite an elaborate, really detailed tree. I'm going to duplicate it one more time. I just want to thicken it up. Some of the branches were looking a little transparent for some reason, probably because I had it set to 70%. Merge them together one last time. And there we go, there's our tree. I'm going to blur it in slightly, so adjustments, Gaussian blur, and just soften it in. So any little anomalies now that appeared within those branches, I just kind of softened and lessened. So 2% should just put it all together really quite effectively. I'm going to create a layer above, layer 12. I'm going to go back to the artistic leatherwood brush. I'm going to switch to one of my darker colors. So third color on the middle row, down to the top end of 2%, 20% opacity, and we're just starting to build in a set of darker colors now at this point. Especially here in the foreground, it's got to really start popping a little bit more than the other things we've already got. So we can create a bit of a transition, perhaps just in the lower part of this section here, we're going to have a little bit more of the intense colors, a little bit more darkness creeping in. Turn it up again perhaps to 5% size, 40% opacity like we had before. And we can just start really blotting in these foreground details. Go back to our colours, fourth colour this time, even darker, reduce it down to 2% size, start bringing in a little bit more randomly now, just a bit patchier, bringing in some texture. Just in kind of dashes that cuts across really, not in straight lines, it's got to be a bit more broken than that. And obviously most of the dark colours are going to be here in the foreground. The real dark colours will get bleached out as they go further back. We're going to add a few more just perhaps in this region, just some bands and some stripes that join together and create these little connection points. It brings it all together as like a path almost that runs through the water. Then going to change to just a slightly different hue. So we've got this colour. If you go on the colour disc, we just use something that's much more in the red, and this is more towards the orange. It oddly, by contrast, will have almost more of a green hint to it, which is very odd. When you put certain colours together, then they do have an impact on each other, and this, by contrast, will almost look green. It's very strange sometimes what happens with colours when you put them together, but this next to the other colours, yes, does have a suggestion of a green, which is great. Just slide some of this in, just some breakaway points as well along the edge. We are on the leatherwood brush, so it kind of does that a little bit for us, but we can further push that. Then go to the next one, which is even darker. And again, we can build in more and more of this texture, especially in this foreground. Some lumps and shapes. Stay on the same layer for all of this. We're going to go for the next layer, which is fourth now from the right, in case it gets a little trickier to just identify what I'm doing. And this is starting to increase some highlights now in this section, keeping it quite loose. And then we've got this really nice kind of more blatantly an orange colour. And we've got the sun here, so there's every reason that it should create highlights on here as well. Anything that really sticks up the top edge is just going to catch the light perhaps and shine some of that glow in a more obvious way. I just reduce it down to the lowest part of 2%, just so I can really go in there and just be a bit more precise. Just add a few more highlights and tap in some kind of like a mottled texture in here. Just break it up so it doesn't look too flat. It's not something you have to agonize over at all. I'm just sweeping across, adding little points as I go. And then the combined effect is that, yeah, we're getting a nice texture that really builds in. Okay, I'm going to create a layer on top of that, layer 13, and I'm going to switch to some of the colors at the bottom. So I've got this first color on the bottom row. You notice I may not be using every single color I've created for the color palette, and that sometimes just happens. Lowest part of 2%, and maybe about 30% strength, still on the leatherwood brush. And I'm just, perhaps that's a bit high, 20% strength, opacity, and I'm just going to start in the very foreground, tapping in some of this here now. And then I can switch to an even darker, more subdued color too. Just vary up some of the textures here too. And then really probably the darkest color we've got is this, which is pretty much black. And again, we can just bring this in probably in the very foreground. Seems the most appropriate. Not too much of that though, I would suggest. Just hints of it. I'm going to take this layer, I'm going to merge down. So all of that extra features on one layer. I'm going to tap it again and merge down. So we're now, if I move it to the side, we have the tree and that land feature all on one layer. And I'm going to tap on a layer and put on alpha lock, which means that anything that I add at this point, so if I move to something really quite clear, so the airbrushing soft brush, 100% with the black, I can only really add now within the confines of those shapes. It only will go up to the edge of that boundary and that's it. Obviously I don't want to do that, but I will go in with that dark color, that black, and with a 2% size and really low at around 10% opacity. I'm just going to start adding in just around some of these edges, like a shadow, like a ledge, so it gives it a little bit of substance, a little bit of weight to that shape and to some of these shapes too perhaps. Once you get so far, I think actually I'm going to turn off the alpha lock and merge it down again to the layer underneath. And we've got more features here too, so I think I might just choose to merge down and merge down again, and everything now is on one layer. That way I can again go back to the alpha lock. With the same process and technique, it will allow me to just really get into everything now. Problem with things being on different layers and you alpha lock one version of it is that you might not be able to affect everything. And I really want to just have the opportunity to affect all of it now. Again, we can use this just to really ramp up some of these edges if they're just not strong enough. And you don't really have to be neat with this because we've got the alpha lock on, so it cannot go across into the water areas. That's really nice. And we can just, again, just push this as it gets closer to us. Add more of this dark, maybe put the size of the brush up 4%, build in some of this darkness in this very foreground as well. I think will work nicely. Perhaps just turn it to 5% size, put it down, 2% opacity, and I think perhaps sometimes we could just darken up certain features. So I just want that tree to be a little bit more prominent, just make it a touch darker that way. And then the bottom part of this land that meets it as well, just a little bit darker. I think that works better. Just have it emerging out of the mist a little bit more prominent, I think is nice. I'm going to go back to these colours. I've got this really light green. Again, it's not green, it's actually yellowy orange, but by contrast to everything else, it really does look green when it's greyed out. I'm going to stay with the soft brush, turn it down to 2% size, 10% opacity, and really in this foreground, in fact that's not strong enough, let's put that up, 30% opacity, and we'll tap in some of this green for the very foreground. We just want it to be a little bit richer, tap it in, small taps, want it to look a little bit more alive, less kind of barren and lifeless, just a bit more vibrant, a bit warmer. And the only real way to do that is to add a little bit more colour. Put it up, 7% size, just tap that in a few times, just soften some of that green in a little bit. It's so strange, isn't it, how the colour will appear green, even though when you go to the colour disc, it's really not green, is it? But yeah, it continues to surprise me. Go to this more obvious orange colour at the top, turn it down, add some of these highlights in here, just a touch more, especially as we said, so underneath the sun. And we could also contrast that with the black. So anywhere where you've got strong highlights, perhaps you're also going to create a stronger shadow too. So the two kind of features can go quite hand in hand. So strong highlights, usually from something that sticks up, therefore it's probably going to have a shadow edge too. Okay, this is the kind of thing you could spend quite a long time on, adding those kind of textures. That whole layer, I'm going to turn off the alpha lock, adjustments, Gaussian blur. There's just one or two edges that are a little bit, the texture doesn't look quite right. So I'm going to blur it in, maybe about 2 or 3%. I'm going to create a new layer. Again, it's called layer 9. There you go. I'm going to switch back to the artistic leatherwood brush, and I'm going to go with the second color on the bottom row. I'm going to set it to the lowest part of 2% size and 20% opacity. And I feel like we need some extra little points of reference texture in the water. We don't need to do a huge amount, just some extra things. It looks too blank in this area and too blank in this area too. Just some extra things to make it apparent that it's not just, this isn't a thing floating in midair, it is actually water. Perhaps we could turn it up a little bit, 3% size. Press on lightly where needed. If you're quite heavy-handed, really turn that down. 10% opacity perhaps, or less. We can always use the motion blur just to soften anything we're adding in here now anyway. If it feels like it's just becoming a little too much, then you can do that. Just some little breakaway textures that almost join in at those edges perhaps. You decide. Perhaps we'll even go in with a lighter colour. So maybe this pink colour, third colour on the top row. Turn it down again, so we're really subtle, so about 5% size, and we can just, I don't know, bring in some variety of different textures. That's a bit big, isn't it? So down into the 2%. Now there's something that I just, looking at this, realised I've missed, so I'm going to go back and add this. Really quite an important section, really. This is sometimes what happens. And with that layer, I'm actually going to use the Gaussian blur, I think. I think the motion blur will just do some strange things to it. So I'm just going to blur it 3%. And yeah, we're missing an important feature. We should have some kind of reflection of the tree. So we can easily fix that. We've got the layer, the bottom version of layer 9. We'll just go to the selection, freehand, draw around the important piece of information, like so. 3 fingers down, copy, 3 fingers down again, paste, and there it is now, just the tree section. Flip it vertically, and then we can move it to where we need it to be. Now we're not going to see most of this, and that's absolutely fine. I'll shrink it, not shrink it, I'll go to the free form and squash it a little bit, just so we have more of an impact in the water, like that. Then I'm going to use the eraser on the soft brush. Doesn't matter the size really, just so you've got enough of a size just to control it. Remove all the bits that you don't want. We don't want it on the land, obviously. And we also need to go to the adjustments, motion blur, to about the 20% will work. Then we can always go to the selection tool again, and just that bit's okay, but this bit just isn't blurred enough for something that is coming all the way here. So close it. Then we can go to the adjustments, motion blur, blur it in again, perhaps not 20%, 10%, deselect. And if it still isn't doing it enough, then you can reselect an even lesser amount perhaps. Motion blur, blur that in even more. And then yeah, the combination of all those different blurs, I think it will work. And if it is just a little bit strong, go to the N, reduce the opacity of it, and maybe just want it as a really subtle element. Doesn't need to be super strong, maybe put it even at 50%. So it's there, it should be there, but it's not too powerful. I'm going to go to layer 9 again, the one above it, with my airbrushing soft brush, set to the black colour and reduce it down to 2% size, 10% opacity, and I'm just going to go in a little bit and just add a few dark touches here. I think that we need, especially in this foreground area, just some dark textures. up, 30% strength opacity, really ramp it up in places. Okay, I'm going to leave this tutorial here at this point. I hope you've learned a few interesting techniques that you can apply to your own work. So in addition to the versions that I show you here over at YouTube, I do also do an extended version over at my Patreon page, as you can see in this example on the screen. And if you want access to these extended details, then there is a link for this down in the description, but also specifically for the video you've just watched, there will be a link down in the comments, probably from tomorrow when I finish that extended version. Anyway, if you've enjoyed this tutorial, please give this video a thumbs up, hit the subscribe, and don't forget the bell notification. And I shall catch you back here soon. Bye for now.